Hello everyone, my name is Rivky Weiss and I'm a licensed clinical social worker in Brooklyn. Our topic for today is going to be on dissociation. It's in response to a question posted by a follower. How can I get rid of constant dissociation? In order to answer this question, I think we first need to understand what is dissociation, how does it happen, and why do we have it? Dissociation is a way to cope with extremely stressful experiences. You might experience dissociation sometimes as a symptom of other mental health issues such as PTSD, borderline, bipolar, schizophrenia, anxiety, or depression. So here are some examples of what dissociation can look like. Dissociation can look like flashbacks, where we're re-experiencing a past event and feel as if it's happening now, and we feel disconnected with the reality. We're kind of back in the event. Dissociation can also mean losing touch with reality or blanking out. A simple example can be getting into the car and not remembering how you got to this place, or walking into another room not remembering what you came for, what you needed to do. Sometimes it looks like losing time. It can also look like depersonalization, which is an out-of-body experience. Think of it like somebody feeling as if they're in the room, they're here, but they're kind of floating above, as if maybe like you're a drone or something, or an outsider looking in. But they don't feel present on the ground, they kind of feel like they're floating in the room. Dissociation can also mean derealization, which means when the world around you or objects around you don't feel real, or the world feels foggy, or you feel like there's a glass separating you from the rest of the world. So there's a lot of people associate dissociation with DID, which is dissociative identity disorder. This used to be called multiple personality disorder. And as time has gone by and we've studied and done more trauma studies and learned more about parts and what happens when a person is traumatized, the name was changed from multiple personality disorder to DID, which is dissociative identity disorder. There's this common misconception that people with dissociative identity disorder have multiple personalities. They're like 5 different people in one. In actuality, they're almost less than a personality. What happens in DID is that there's a separation between their consciousness, their memory, their identity. And each part is separated. You can think of it like a bunch of Russian nesting dolls where one little piece fits into the other, but each one is separated by a very thick wall, and they're not together. Dissociative identity disorder describes a particular set of symptoms that include not only dissociation, but a fragmentation of identity. Dissociative identity disorder is a particular diagnosis. It is possible to have dissociation without this diagnosis. Dissociation is a trauma response, as we're going to get to in a minute. And just because you have dissociation doesn't mean you have DID. People with DID usually develop DID in response to severe physical and or sexual abuse in childhood. And they develop this fragmented personality in response to the people who are supposed to be taking care of them and keeping them safe, and they're not. And they just develop their own coping mechanisms of how to survive. So we're going to talk about dissociation as a trauma response. And I'm going to give some examples, but one of the ways that we can see dissociation in real life is, unfortunately, if anybody has listened to interviews from hostages that were released, Israeli hostages that came back from Gaza, children and adults both, many of them describe different symptoms of dissociation. Some described losing sense of time, night and day, not knowing where they were. Some described feeling like they were floating, feeling very confused. And then I've also seen an interview where I think it was a family member of one of the children discussed how the child came back and described her experiences in a very detached way, as if it didn't even happen to her, as if it happened to someone else. She kind of disconnected from her experiences. So why do our brains dissociate? Dissociation is a survival technique. It's a way that a person in a traumatic situation can survive and can keep going. When any type of situation, a trauma, abuse, anything terrifying happens, and a person has to continue living, they have to, if we take an example of a child who's being abused at home and they have to go to school the next day, they have to separate from their trauma to be able to continue living their life. Or if we want to take the examples of the hostages, in order to survive, some of them separated from the reality. And it was almost like it wasn't happening to them, and that kept them going, and that made it able for them to keep going. So dissociation is, at its core, a protective response to trauma. It's what helps us move forward and sometimes locks away the traumatic experiences. Sometimes we hear people say that, they only remembered a traumatic event 20, 30, 5, 10, it doesn't matter, any number of years later, and there was no memory of it before. Sometimes different events or different triggers make you remember. But the reason for that is because your brain dissociated from the terrible thing that happened and allowed you to move forward. So the question is, if dissociation is, so here's the problem. Dissociation, though, as an adult, is not very helpful. People find that they're bothered by the symptoms of dissociation, whether it's flashbacks, or they're bothered by not connecting, not feeling grounded, not feeling connected to the world, or losing time. So it turns out that while it's helpful in the moment and can keep a person going, eventually it's not helpful at all, and it ends up being bothersome. An easy way to explain what dissociation does is to imagine a lifeguard who their job is to protect people swimming in the pool. And if we want to compare that to dissociation, the lifeguard eventually stops being able to distinguish with what's a danger now and what's not a danger. So imagine the lifeguard blowing their whistle at an empty pool, or at a neighbor's pool that they're not even lifeguarding. Or what if they blow their whistle at a kiddie pool? Or what if they see water in the kitchen sink and they start blowing their whistle? So they're always sounding the alarm, even in times when there is no danger and they don't have to do their job. This is what it's like to dissociate as an adult, or when you're out of danger. You're like the lifeguard who's blowing the whistle at the kitchen sink. What happens is that the brain starts looking at any type of trigger as a danger signal, and it loses the ability to differentiate between real and perceived danger. So dissociation helps us when we're in immediate danger, but once the danger is removed, we often continue dissociating because we learned those patterns. So our goal in working with dissociation is usually to, as if we would retrain the lifeguard. If we wanted to keep this lifeguard, we would have to teach them appropriate safety rules, appropriate when it's actually dangerous. They would maybe have to retake their lifeguarding course or learn again what's dangerous. But we can reteach them. They don't have to blow their whistle at an empty pool, but only when somebody's drowning. So essentially, when working with dissociation, we're retraining our brain to relearn how to identify what's dangerous and what's not. Dissociation is nothing to be ashamed of. It doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean your brain is broken. It just means it's been working overtime for a long time, trying to protect you. And now you can teach it how to relax. You can learn new coping mechanisms. The brain is a wonderful thing that can relearn things. It's like the lifeguard that can relearn when to blow their whistle. Your brain can learn, again, how to identify danger. So there are some therapeutic modalities that are helpful working with dissociation. I'm just going to quickly list them off. But the goal of this live is to talk more about things that somebody could do at home and on their own. So some of the things that are helpful working with dissociation is trauma therapy, EMDR, DBT, hypnotherapy, and CBT. But in order to answer the question presented in this live, let's look at things that you can do on your own and things you can do at home. And these things can be combined with therapy or just be done on your own. The first thing you can do is keep a journal. This is helpful for anybody who dissociates and people who have a diagnosis of DID. They might learn to become more familiar with different parts of themselves if they keep on journaling and drawing pictures. When you journal, sometimes even in a dissociation, it's going to give you a window into what you were thinking or what was going on in that time that you can't remember. Because usually after a dissociation, a person can't remember what happened. A dissociation can be for 5 minutes, but sometimes it can be for an hour. So if you're journaling or drawing, it gives you an idea of what happened in that time. Another thing that can be helpful is if you have a therapist or if you've done this on your own, if you have a calm, secure place, is to imagine yourself going there. This can be done when you start feeling distressed or you start feeling like you're going to dissociate. Another thing that can be helpful is to imagine yourself wearing protective clothing, like a hazmat suit or a raincoat, or putting yourself kind of like in a bubble where you're there but you're protected so the danger can't touch you. There are many grounding techniques that could be helpful, but here are a couple that specifically are helpful with dissociation. Dissociation is triggered by a fight or flight response. It's a trauma response, which often makes you feel not grounded and disconnected. So here are a couple of grounding techniques that could be helpful to make you feel more grounded and be able to come back to reality. The first one is breathing. Particular breathing exercise that people find helpful when dissociated is square breathing. What square breathing means is that you inhale, hold for a few seconds, exhale, hold for a few seconds, and inhale. It's kind of like making a square of inhale, hold, exhale, hold. This can be done as many times as needed, and you try to take breaths as deep as you can and hold for as long as possible. Another technique that people find helpful is walking barefoot if the circumstances allow. Let's say you're in your house, walking barefoot especially on different textures like on carpet, on tile. Many people find that the act of being barefoot connects them to the ground, which makes them feel grounded. People find that using ice cubes shocks them back in reality and helps to bring them back. Then there's another very common grounding exercise called the 5 senses exercise, which is using as many of your 5 senses as you can. It's looking at things that you can see, things that you can hear. It's usually a list of, depending where you are and what you have access to, it's, let's say, 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can smell, 2 things you can touch, and something you can put in your mouth, which could be a warm drink or a cold drink, and this could be modified for wherever you are and whatever is going on. Any type of grounding exercise that you've practiced with your therapist that has been helpful, or if you don't go to therapy and you have any type of grounding, breathing exercise that brings you back to the present. Some people find listening to music or anything that works can be used to help come out of a dissociation. Another thing that some people find helpful is having resourcing material around the house. Like some people create little baskets. It doesn't have to be a basket. It doesn't have to be a basket, but it can be things that you have around your house, around your office, or around where you are. Examples of things that could be helpful is a soft blanket, essential oils that you can smell. Smell often brings us back to the present. Lollipops. Some people find that tasting a lollipop can bring them back. Some people find that having specifically citrus body wash can help wake them up in the shower. The smell of lemon or lime wakes them up. You can have ice cubes in a tray. This is something that's personal to everyone. You find things that work for you and have them handy, because it's difficult to reach for them when you're dissociated. Sometimes when a person is dissociated, they're not in the space that they can go get themselves an ice cube or get themselves a lollipop. If you live with other people, your family can help you. When they see that you're dissociated, they can give you something. They can help you by giving you your blanket, a lollipop, an ice cube, whatever it is. Sometimes some people can feel that they're going to dissociate. They start feeling themselves losing touch with reality. Then having something handy that they can use immediately, like an essential oil or an ice cube, can help ground them. It's also helpful to have a support system, people you can talk to. This can be family, friends, a therapist, an online support group, an in-person support group, anything where you can share and be with other people who are experiencing things similar to you can be very helpful. There's another thing that people find helpful with journaling, is that after a dissociative episode, once you come back, even though you don't remember what happened, to, as carefully as you can, try to retrace exactly minute by minute details of what happened that caused you to dissociate. Sometimes people know that when they smell a certain thing, or they see a certain thing, or they hear a certain song, they dissociate. So they know they can try to protect themselves from that, or not listen to that music, or not have that food in their house, or whatever it is. Sometimes it's from a loud noise. They know this is what causes them to dissociate. But sometimes people don't know. They don't know what triggers them into a flashback or dissociation. So thinking back to everything you saw, heard, or thought about before a dissociative episode can be helpful if you journal it, and then you might see a pattern. Sometimes it takes a while to see a pattern. Not always can you see a pattern, but it's helpful if you can. Then it's also easier to retrain your brain and teach it that the smell of this or this song is not really as dangerous. So bottom line is that dissociation is there to protect you, even though it's not serving you today. Your brain developed it as a protection, and it served you well. It doesn't mean you're broken or damaged or anything like that. It just means that we need to reteach the brain how to identify stress and trauma and learn what is actually dangerous today and what you can handle. Thank you for listening, and have a good night.